So now we get to the COLREGs. Let's start by considering for a while what the COLREGs are in general terms. They are basically the navigation rules for the seas. They were published by the International Maritime Organization in 1972. The IMO is a United Nations special agency which is responsible for regulating shipping. The name of the COLREGs is officially the Convention on the International Regulations for Preventing Collisions at Sea. They replaced the old collision regulations of 1960, which were adopted at the same time as the 1960 SOLAS Convention. And the main aim and motivation of the convention is quite simple: to prevent collisions between two or more vessels at the sea. They set up an international guideline for operating at sea to ensure that all the ships follow the same rules and the same procedures. There is still some space outside the COLREGs, however, as they allow specific rules of navigation, for instance, for inland waters. But they recommend that they would always conform to the COLREGs. And also, for instance, the racing rules used in sailing competitions may differ from the COLREGs in certain details. But for the most part, COLREGs are the rules to follow when sailing the world's oceans. One of the most important innovations in the 1972 COLREGs was the recognition given to traffic separation schemes. We will get back to this when we discuss rule number 10 in more detail. Let's have a look at the brief history of the COLREGs. Before there were international rules and practices, there were separate practices and various conventions and informal procedures in different parts of the world. So there were inconsistencies and even contradictions in practices, and they gave rise to unintended collisions at sea. The navigation lights for operating in darkness, as well as the navigation marks, were not standardized. So they gave rise to quite dangerous confusion and ambiguity between the vessels, and therefore risk of colliding as well. Also, the appearance of steam-powered ships in the mid-19th century meant that the conventions for sailing vessel navigation had to be supplemented with conventions for power-driven vessel navigation. The sailing vessels are limited regarding their maneuverability in that they cannot sail directly into the wind and they cannot be readily navigated in the absence of wind. Steamships and other power-driven vessels, however, they can maneuver regardless of the wind in all 360 degrees of direction. So this had to be taken account also in the rules. There were various British, US, and other countries' rules in existence. For instance, the 1838 Act of Congress of the United States stated that steamboats had to use signal lights between sunset and sunrise, but they did not specify what kind of lights. Similarly, in the UK, the Steam Navigation Act of 1846 established, for instance, that steamships need to pass each other port to port, so the left side of the vessel against the left side of the other vessel. And crossing vessels need to do course alterations always to starboard. 2 years later, in 1848, the green and red sidelights and a white masthead light were required by the Act. In 1863, the British, in consultation with the French government, developed a new set of rules, and those were adopted 1 year later in 1864 by more than 30 nations, including the US, where President Abraham Lincoln signed the rules to prevent collisions at sea into a US law. These first international rules included, for instance, a rule that the overtaking vessel was required to stay out of the way of the overtaken vessel, and that the stand-on vessel was only required to maintain its course. In 1889, the United States convened the first International Maritime Conference in Washington, D.C., and the resulting rules were adopted 1 year later in 1890 and became in effect in 1897. Significant developments in these rules included a requirement for stand-on vessels to maintain speed as well as the course, for steamships to carry a second masthead light, and for the giveaway vessel not to cross ahead of the stand-on vessel, and also for the use of whistle signals to indicate course changes. Along the years, amendments were made to these rules, and then in 20th of October in 1972, the international regulations for preventing collisions at sea were adopted as a convention of the International Maritime Organization and entered into force on 15th of July 1977. So these are the COLREGs. And as of June 2020, this convention has been ratified by 160 states, representing 99.0% of the tonnage of the world's merchant fleet. So it's really widely adopted convention. It has been amended several times, for instance in 1981 with regard to dredging and surveying in traffic separation schemes. In 1987, several rules were amended, and in 1989, unnecessary use of the inshore traffic zones associated with the traffic separation schemes was stopped. In 1993, there were amendments regarding the positioning of lights on the vessels, and in 2001, there were added rules relating to winging ground effect craft, and then in 2007, the text of Annex 4, the distress signals, was rewritten. So it's a kind of living document in the sense that it's amended whenever necessary, but for the most part, many of the rules that are in existence have existed for perhaps hundreds of years, but now they are written into international document, a convention, which is adopted by a vast majority of the countries in the world. So that's it about the history. Let's now go into the convention itself.